It is wonderful to be here. As Anna mentioned, I'm more or less the warm-up act. You're going to be hearing and learning a lot more from Sultan in just a second. I started Onfido back in 2010, and I'm just going to be sharing some key lessons on starting and scaling and building the next wave of unicorns. I start by thinking about every startup in 3 stages, distinct stages. And there's going to be pretty significant different components, lessons, practices to put in place for each stage. The first is the pre-product market fit stage. All of you know, it's where you're trying to test different methods to see, is there a key problem to solve? The second is a product market fit stage. And the third is a scale stage. And the key point to make here is that at every stage, you're going to need a whole different set of practices, people, priorities, and beyond. Just to illustrate, when I left Onfido and 2 years ago started Quench, which is again pre-product market fit early stage company, some of the key changes I needed to make first was at a scale up at Onfido, I was constantly delegating, trying to find any reason I could delegate anything. But back into very early stage, I had to learn to do everything myself again. Be in the customer conversations, do all the key necessary steps as small as they may be. Second, at a scale up, you're constantly looking to hire, your priority is market share, but again, it's very different in early stage. If you're wired for that, then you're going to struggle going back to an early stage again. Because early stage, you really shouldn't be focused on market share. You should just pick your half a dozen customers if you're in B2B, just doing all that you can to impress them, making sure you're actually solving a very key and burning problem, and then slowly going for the next stage, which is product market fit and beyond. And not hiring either. You probably need a small team nowadays, a 6, 12, 18 max, before you make it to the next stage. And this might help explain sometimes where you have a founder that's gone through the stages, starts a second company, and just raises massive rounds, like hires loads of people, gets loads of press, and then 2 years later, everything suddenly like abruptly ends. It's probably because they were looking to take shortcuts. They may well have not had product market fit, and they've tried to short circuit these steps that they need to take. Second, in an organization, I typically simplify things, and I think of every organization as people, processes, and priorities. People, for me, remains, always has been, and will always will remain, by far the most important factor. It's the thing that essentially underpins everything else. And so I'm going to spend a bit more time on people in just a second. Processes are the playbooks. You're learning, you're hiring people to help you essentially put the best processes in place. Obviously, AI has a big impact on this in particular, which I'll touch upon in a little bit. And then you have priorities. You've got explicit priorities that are written. You probably have weekly ones, monthly ones, quarterly ones, annual ones, whatever they are. Documented, you can share it with everyone. That's well understood. What is less well understood is implicit priorities. Culture is typically captured by that. It's norms and habits. It's described sometimes as how a decision is made if you're not in the room. And that is lived through a culture which is exhibited by founders, leadership, and beyond. But they are as important as often the unwritten rules and norms in an organization. So all 3 matter and continuously need to be evolved, and often need to be changed at each of the stages, pre-product market fit, and scale. Except for maybe the key priority around the vision. On balance, the vision tends to stay the same throughout. Maybe it's better articulated in later stages. So as I mentioned, for me, the people part is by far and away the most important. So just to talk a little bit more about that in particular. And how does one go trying to hire the most appropriate, the most essentially exceptional, talented people you can have on your team. There are different parts to it. It's not just the hiring. I'm just going to focus on the hiring, but it's also crucially the development and beyond. And an environment for them to flourish, and a set of priorities, cultural values, and everything else for them to flourish. But I'm just going to briefly touch on the hiring piece. What's worked for me quite well is focusing on these 3 areas, like humble, hungry, and high potential. The humble part is, do they have an ego? Are they potentially a psychopath? I would say what is maybe not known as well is 1% of the population are psychopathic, often through no fault of their own, and they need support. But 4% of CEOs are. And it's just something that's lost upon people. And that's your job. You just need to find people that are going to get along well with colleagues and essentially share your company values. Hungry in the sense that I feel that people in early stage startups that are hungry just act a bit differently to your average employee. And this is, end of the day on a Friday, there's still one client email to get out. Are they going to just sit down and do it and just get it out because they feel better, they have a better weekend knowing that they've done the work, or do they not? And that really comes down to how hungry are they? Are they mission-driven? Do they put that discretionary output to make sure everything they touch, everything that they do is the absolute best it could possibly be? It's hard to describe, but you will know when you're working with colleagues and you're all mission-driven and they're all essentially hungry to achieve the mission, at least as hungry as you as a founder or the leadership team are. And high potential, I think, is actually the most misunderstood one. Most hiring decisions, or I should say the wrong hiring decisions, basically try to simplify it in that let's find the resumes, let's shortlist for whoever's got the best grades from the most fancy universities or fancy prestigious places, and that's kind of it. That's, in my experience, like missing the points. Often, it's less about how pedigreed they are necessarily, but it's, for a startup in particular, it's sort of how much potential do they have. For instance, if they have a fancy resume, as I'm sure almost everyone in this room does, with fancy degrees from fancy places, and versus a candidate who maybe not even has gone to university, but is a fast learner within sort of a month of being at the organization, is learning, trying new things, thinking in different ways, you tend to find that high potential is by far and away the most important thing, especially because in a startup, most of the people and the skills that you're hiring at an early stage very quickly become redundant. So it's about how fast they can adapt and learn, which determines how fast they progress. As you're scaling your companies, this point around betting on the future and holding to those bets really, really matter. If I go back to 2010 when we started Onfido, our bet was, this is at the time, most identity verification happened inside a bank branch, for instance, and you had to queue and go through paper-based processes, or was based on a credit bureau model, which again we felt was outdated and insufficient. And when I went to the first few investors, not few, it was actually very many investors for the first 2 years, most of them said, we can't invest because we would have to have 2 miracles happen for this to work. So our pitch was, in the future, everyone's going to take a photo of their ID and a photo of their face to sign up to these online accounts. And the response was, well, there's a technological miracle that needs to happen. You are telling us that machine learning, computer vision, narrow AI is going to be better at detecting fraudulent patterns on an ID than the human eye can. That doesn't make sense to us. Whereas we said, yes, as long as you have enough of a sample size, we have the evidence and the theory to suggest as the sample size grows, machine learning will do a better job of detecting fraudulent IDs than the human eye. But again, it was a hypothesis. We couldn't prove it. It was just, it was our bet and not shared by others. The second miracle was a behavioral one, that the investors said, you expect everyone to start taking photos of their personal IDs, the most sensitive data points that they have, when there's online fraud and all these challenges and stories of leaks and so on. And you expect people to start taking selfies of themselves on a regular basis, which, again, was not a consensus view or even believable by most. And it took us a few years to raise sufficient funding to grow the team and then build the product and beyond. But why that's relevant now in an age of AI is as you're building whatever it is that you're building and focusing on, you'll probably take a specific view or an assumption or a bet that in all likelihood will be the minority view, not a consensus view. If it were a consensus view, you'd probably have 10 times as many competitors as you probably already do. What matters is that you're betting on something, that you're holding true to that, and obviously as you get evidence, there's nothing wrong with changing it, but you're remembering that even if many don't believe what you're saying, as long as you have the conviction and you prove it with the evidence over time, then then essentially it should be recognized as a bet. I want to finish on the whole pre-product market fit, product market fit, and scale stage, talking a bit about founder mode. And this is understanding what stage of the company you're in, understanding how to hire, understanding the different parts. The founder mode is most relevant for the later stage of a scale-up's journey. This is where you're a team of maybe a couple of hundred people, and you're across maybe multiple geographies. It's where it seems the chaos just seems to grow. And I think that the founder mode analogy is a very, very good one, but sometimes misunderstood. And there's a distinction between corporate CEOs versus founder CEOs. Corporate CEOs tend to manage via exec teams, and there's a whole model with that, and that you tend to have a larger hierarchy, and that runs its course. What makes founder CEOs special is the superpower of founder mode. And this is the helicopter analogy is, so you are monitoring a company, you have a bottleneck approach, you think, this is an area that's maybe red, let me helicopter down, find and solve the problem, and then come back up and go elsewhere and so on. This works really, really well. When it is misunderstood, it's just thinking of the person in the helicopter, the founder CEO, goes around, shouts at people, or like bulldozes their way through. But in reality, where it's successful is where there's a deep curiosity from the founder as to, I want to solve this bottleneck, let me go in deep, sit down with the engineer, or sit down with whoever it is trying to solve something. Let me find out exactly what they're trying, what the bottlenecks are, what my intuition is, what theirs is, to have that learning and colleague level experience, so that I can then identify, is it because their team needs more experience? Is it because we are doing something fundamentally wrong in the company? Is it a communication issue? Whatever it is, the magic spell is put to action, that bottleneck is resolved, and then on to the next bottleneck, and on to the next bottleneck. The function of a founder CEO at a scale stage, where I've seen it work the best, is actually is this. The helicopter analogy is like fine. I prefer to think of it more of a cowboy analogy, where you have in the cowboy movies, you got like this caravan with wagons and horses and a whole set of different types of animals, and you're trying to take them from maybe one area to another. The cowboy sort of lead sometimes would be at the very front of the caravan, scouting for risks and essentially setting the direction. Sometimes being at the very back, making sure no one's left behind, or the pace is a good pace. But often throughout the journey, monitoring which wagons are coming out of this caravan, and then riding with the horse, making sure they're aligned again, and constantly going back and forth in that. So that every team member can focus on their own wagon and their own section and making sure it's headed in the right direction without bringing everything to a standstill. This all still holds before the age of Gen AI. There are a few things that amplify and have implications for it, though, especially team members and org structures and so on. And in the age of AI, my favorite book that is Dr. Pink in 2005, 20 years ago, wrote about how right brain thinkers will rule the future. And essentially, it breaks it down in simple terms. The human brain has two hemispheres. On the left-hand side is analytics. It's often, you could think of it at times as IQ, it's memory and things of that nature. And the right hemisphere is more context and perspective and judgment and connecting things and things of that nature. The challenge we have is that most of our career, academic and post, has been geared to identifying and cherishing and celebrating the left hemisphere. These are the exams that you've had and what you've essentially had to do to get onto the amazing careers that you've had so far. The problem is that AI is actually very, very good at parts of that and a growing share of that, whereas AI is terrible at the right hemisphere things. And as such, there's going to be a dual effect. The skill set in an organization and the skill set that your team members have are increasingly going to require less of their left hemisphere and much more of their right hemisphere. There's also John Vervaeke, who wrote about different types of intelligence: propositional intelligence, procedural intelligence, perspectival intelligence. Breaks it down in a pretty useful, insightful ways. So some of the implications for organizations, as you're learning and building about how to grow AI companies, we're probably going to have organizations that don't think of roles in the way they do currently, and are probably going to think of it more as domains and spaces. So coding, for instance, these are early ones that we've already seen. There's a dual effect. So whereas AI is going to lead to junior developers being less needed, in large part because AI can do a pretty good job pattern recognition, drafting code. At the same time, senior engineers are going to become more in demand, where they can pass their judgments as to which bits make sense for them to deploy. Similar with legal, paralegals, copy-pasting different pieces of copy to just draft contracts. AI does very well, and yet the senior lawyer, their judgments on is this the appropriate things to be putting in, and there's a weighted risk is going to grow. And equally, customer service, about 80% of the tickets of the average organization are repeated and repetitive. This is your questions around what is your return policy, which AI is going to take care of. And then you're going to have 20% repurposed and focused on triaging the more difficult judgment, emotion-based decisions of that nature. And this is in large part what interested me in my new company, new startup, Quench.ai. So we help mid-market companies deploy, discover, and scale AI inside. We do a free AI use case report for any organization that's interested, and it's something that we continuously think about and evolve. So with that, I want to thank you. I'll pass over to Sultan just a second. After Sultan's presentation, we'll also be doing questions. So thank you for listening, and welcome, Sultan.
Thanks, Husayn. So how to build an AI unicorn? I think Husayn has covered a lot of the key bases. And I know there's a diverse audience in the room, so I wanted to unpack some of the frameworks that apply within two of the things that Husayn touched on. The adapting your decisions to the phases you're at. In Husayn's case, he defined it as the pre-PMF, PMF scale. And thinking in bets. Husayn talked about betting on the future. I'll unpack a little bit more around what actually treating all your decisions like bets looks like and how that's critical to thinking about the sort of unicorn innovation cycle. But before jumping into that, I want to talk a little bit about frameworks and playbooks in general. It took me 10 years to get Beamery from 2013 when we started to being a unicorn. I think today, hopefully, anyone trying to do that can do that a lot faster and maybe with an army of agents rather than the sort of things that applied 10 years ago. But it's important to consider any playbooks as something that you draw insights from in order to build your own. Because almost every really successful company hasn't just followed a playbook, but has created some innovation, not just in their product or picking the right market, but in some of the processes they have, some of the ways they work, their service models. So it's important to consider where your uniqueness will come. Or as Oscar said, be yourself, everyone's already taken. And so I will add an extra phase to the ones Husayn mentioned, which is sustain. What happens once you get to a certain scale? How do you think about sustaining scale, and what does that look like? And I'll collapse the pre-PMF, PMF into survive. But really, it's the same kind of principle, which is each of these phases has very different decision frameworks that apply and very different ways to think about what creates the right bets and the right risk management. Now, in our journey, I can think of the 10 years as really being broken down into 3 chapters. The first 3 years was our survival phase, that finding pre-product market fit, which I'll unpack in a moment. We then spent about 3 years really finding that product market fit and figuring out what are the things that give us escape velocity. Because scale really is about finding the kind of feedback loops that give you a growing competitive advantage. Now, for AI companies, that's often the data, the training, but oftentimes the escape velocity also comes from the feedback loops that make your people and your teams and your processes better than anybody else's through repeatability and time. So figuring out whether you've created feedback loops is important to figure out whether your scale is going to be self-sustaining. And now, the final phase, I think oftentimes we think of the sort of S-curves of innovation, where sustain means you are at the top of the S-curve, how do you make it profitable, and so forth. But by its very nature, and especially today with how rapid innovation is, and certainly in our journey, sustain is about maintaining self-disruption, not just about creating good unit economics and efficiencies, but actually about embedding the culture of innovation and the survival mindset that got you started in the first place. And that's very easy to lose, and I'll talk a little bit about how to manage the risk of that. So I'll start with the survive phase, the sort of pre-product market fit. The image you see here is of the Mechanical Turk. Could you give me a show of hands if you're familiar with the Mechanical Turk? Okay, so a couple of people in the room. So the Mechanical Turk was one of the original fake it till you make it. It was in the 18th century, a chess automaton that beat the Emperor Napoleon. So in that image you see, it was actually not an automaton or robot, but actually a small person with magnets playing chess and beat the emperor. Now, you often get the stories in a lot of early-stage companies of the kind of things that they had to fake and survive. But one of the interesting things, I think, when you look at innovation from new founders versus the kind of innovation that you try to do within a corporation when you're trying to make bets, is it's difficult to match the kind of survival bet the house intensity that a new founder would apply if you're doing something from the sort of safety net, either within a corporation or even if you're doing something not for the first time. It's why so many success stories are first-time immigrant founders and so forth. So how do you find that mindset of being willing to bet the house while also avoiding the hubris of making bets that you don't know how to walk away from? So the first key thing in survival is finding that balance, being willing to bet the house and being willing to walk away. In our case, we found that moment of knowing that actually being willing to bet the house can be a bad thing and can draw you into sort of self-rationalizing that you found product market fit about a year in. When we first built our AI models, we used it to figure out what skills people had to match them to jobs and built this marketplace in the sort of traditional lean startup mindset, had revenue early on, and we were convincing ourselves that we were finding product market fit. And it took us stepping away and asking ourselves a question about a year in. This seems to be working, but if we were to start from scratch with everything we've learned now, would we be doing exactly the same thing, or would we do something differently? And in confronting that question, we ended up evolving into using our AI to build enterprise software rather than the marketplace we started with. But that could be a hard question to face. Now, at the same time, not being willing to bet the house is how a lot of things die. You hear some amazing stories from companies like Airbnb. Some of you will probably know this, but Airbnb, at a crucial moment, the founders ended up pivoting to making cereal boxes, Obama O's and Cap'n McCain's, and that gave them the $30,000 that meant Airbnb survived. So you need to have the willingness to do those types of things as well as the rationality to be able to walk away. The second thing you need to know how to do is know when to double down. Now, doubling down in the sort of boundaries of when are we finding the kind of product market fit that we should be chasing versus what's a false promise goes back a little bit to how do you really think in bets. The life cycle of any company is thousands of decisions and thousands of bets that you place, but we rarely think of our decisions or indecisions with true bias analysis. In fact, the kind of people that try and shoot for the moonshots and the unicorn companies are often the most guilty of rationalizing your existing biases, treating any information as validating your thesis rather than challenging it. So it's important to consider as you look at what is us finding our product market fit and us scaling to our vision look like to figure out how do I challenge my own biases and find what's true. Now, in the world we were in, which is enterprise software, I really like the framework from Jason Lemkin, who writes about how once you can see successful customers that are inbound to you, not just family and friends and networks, but people who came to you and didn't churn, and in his case, he has the rule of 10. Once you've done that 10 times, might seem like nothing, but it's everything, never quit. Now, this will, of course, look different in different businesses and different industries, but the framework of it's not about just a certain amount of scale, but a certain amount of validation is critical. Because once you do have that conviction, you can double down early in the right direction rather than placing too many bets. Now, for us, that came in the form of one particular early customer, which was our first seven-figure customer. And it wasn't the logo, it was Facebook that made this a bet the double down kind of conviction for us, but it was what it proved about the size of the problem for a company like Facebook. At the time, we were an 8-person team, and they bet their entire global recruiting processes and organization on being powered by technology. And to us, when we thought about it, that was enough to double down and stop a lot of the other things we're doing. Focus in on the ideal customer profile that represented and really double down on that aspect of our company. And that's what ended up being the business that grew into the unicorn. Now, scale is interesting because the principles of how we scale, obviously there's a lot of playbooks around how to think about scale in terms of people, efficiencies, and so forth. But I think it's very important, especially as you start finding product market fit and growing, to re-question, am I still scaling in the right direction? It's very easy to make something efficient that perhaps shouldn't have been done at all. And one principle of scaling in terms of finding what are we improving as an advantage is that element I touched on, which is escape velocity. Are you scaling in a way that makes what you are doing impossible to beat? Now, in our world, that wasn't just about our AI and the data and the product, but also about creating flywheels of what allowed us to build the best partnerships in the industry, which further fed into the best data that we had in the industry, that further fed into the advantage that we had. Another common element of how to think about sort of efficiencies and escape velocity and scale comes down to how do you optimize your talent. Now, this is an example that is often cited in playbooks around the evolution of talent specialization as you grow the business. And a common refrain is that you start moving from generalists that you had when you were a 10-person team to specialists in different areas. And I'm sure many of you in this room will have lots of specialists in your different teams. But in practice, I think this mindset is outdated for the age of AI, because the kind of thing that you need to maintain innovation is high talent density of generalists. And that isn't just about the people you have, it's about continuously evolving the roles that you have. I imagine there are lots of people in this room that have started creating roles in your businesses like GTM engineers using tools like Clay. Traditional profiles in sales and product who are specialists might not be the right fit to create those new roles. So in order to continue scaling, you have to not just think about having the right people in each role, but evolving the key roles in your business continuously and having enough density of people who are agile and nimble in your teams to adapt into those new roles, to adopt new tools. In our case, we've had business development representatives building products for their teams. Not everyone would do that, and the people that did that helped us evolve and create new roles and maintain innovation as we scaled. The next piece, as you start to find that escape velocity and find your competitive advantage, is thinking about how do we sustain that scale and continue evolving and growing. And I mentioned earlier this question of how do you maintain innovation. And it doesn't come down to just your product, it comes down to embedding a culture of creative destruction. It's very difficult to avoid becoming the next BlackBerry just by thinking about what happens in the future. Nobody plans for that to happen. But it happens to a lot of companies because you lose the kind of continuous innovation and survival mindset that a lot of early teams have as you reach a certain point of scale. It's very easy to start developing hubris for how good you are and to start not seeing some of the signals in the market, but it's even harder to maintain the kind of flywheels of rapid innovation connections between your product teams and your commercial teams that are natural to have early on. So one of the things that we started doing is trying to not predict the future, nobody can, but consider what are the ways in which we could cannibalize and disrupt ourselves. One of the things that helped us do that was the degree to which the pandemic transformed the world and created, obviously, new signals. We were in the world of using AI for people decisions, and when we started, we were looking at hiring. The pandemic allowed us to zoom in on new markets like workforce planning, mobility, but it also made us realize that actually some of the operational processes that allow for rapid innovation tempt you towards keeping your best people on the things that are already scaled, where you have the highest demand, the highest revenue. And it's important to find a balance where both your time as a leader or a founder and some of your best people are actually allocated to the unproven projects that will allow you to run the next S-curve and the next cycle of innovation. Thank you all.
So I'll maybe just start us off so people can think of them. So you've both been through multiple different fundraising rounds with Beamery and Onfido. So for the founders here today, what kind of advice would you give to maybe a founder raising their first round in the next kind of 6 to 12 months?
What is, I think, missed by most founders is the expectation of how much value you feel your investors will bring, your VCs will bring. And in my experience, the best way to think about VCs is if I have a scale from -10 to +10, VCs are probably from -10 to maybe +1 or +2. And at best, it's normally angels that will touch on 1 or 2. VCs are primarily in the negative range. So the goal is to have the least damaging VC where you can, in that I've not yet met a VC that will take a company that wasn't going to be a great success and turn it into a great success. It's fundamentally, what it will be at 10 is an amazing co-founder, an amazing exec team, and all those different things. But what I have seen many times is a company that can be absolutely extraordinary be dragged down by VCs in the sort of negative territory. So don't expect too much from any VC. It's just purely because they're spread across, if there's a good VC, a good fund, you're not the only bet. They're spread across 20, 50 other companies, and they're just not able to assist you in the way that you'd like. Now I would say, so reset your expectations, and it's more of a strategy of not maximizing, but damage mitigating.
I'd agree with that. I think there are definitely scenarios, especially early on, such as with hiring, where good investors can be very helpful at tapping into talent. So I think it also depends on whether you see your bigger benefit coming from access to other networks, companies that you might be selling into, or the specific of a real deep industry specialization. But I think to those who were here for the VC panel earlier, I do think this sort of boundary of people who have a certain risk appetite as a VC that fits what you're trying to do, a certain patience, those things can be relevant too. And there were some great discussions around this in the panel earlier with perspectives of people who know how to think about the long term and have made those kind of bets. You can speak to founders who they've invested in and really think about whether the philosophy matches what you're trying to do for your business.
Yeah. All else being equal, if I were to pick between VCs, in the US, 60% of partners at VC firms are former operators, founders, or built. In the UK, it's more like 10%. So there's certainly tons more value from those who've actually built in the past. Is something that I would rate highest as far as like things I would be looking for.
Hi. Oh, shit. Sorry. How do you feel, since you both spoke about how companies, AI companies, scale in different ways, linear teams, more ownership for each employee, do you feel that there is a change in how product decisions, which is in our industry where we're building, do you feel that there is a change in approach in how product decisions are made since, in a way, there are less people, more ownership, they train, in a way, the more right hemisphere, I would say, so they find more patterns, but it's all horizontal in a way, so it's not any more top-down approach like Google with product managers, but it's more horizontal. How do you feel that it changed in approach, and if so, how?
Happy to start. I think definitely, and how would probably depend on the type of customers you're serving in the industry, in the sense that you may still be locked by, let's say you're selling to large enterprises that need certain patterns of releases. Those things might be constraining factors, but you don't necessarily need the designer, product manager, engineering manager, all the sort of usual things that can form teams to operate in that way anymore. You can have individual people do the sort of full gamut of a life cycle. But I think it's important to consider what creates the right innovation flywheel, not just of do we have a designer or a product manager, but actually how are we validating things? How are we validating things through prototypes versus actually validating something deeper? And so I think it's important to be thoughtful around that rather than just the specializations in the team, but it's transformed any team that's being efficient in who does what.
Yeah. And so the first part of your question around, you mentioned even equity. Yes, by definition, if you now need a smaller team, those team members ought to have significantly more equity than they would have had, in prior innovation cycles. I can tell you that with Onfido, we were able to hire the world's best talent from Amazon, Google, and all these big companies because about just over a fifth of the company, 20%, was owned by the team outside of founders and investors, and the average is at best about 8%. So when we're asked why was it that you were able to hire such great talent, it was like, hey, this is, you got to be really good with the equity part. And I'd say it's very much the same now with new AI startups.
Hi guys. Great with you guys founding all these companies. I think the stage I'm at the moment, this sort of early go-to-market stage, I'd be really interested to hear from you guys how maybe you did that in the past, and then maybe nowadays how you think things might have changed a little bit from perhaps 10 years ago, and perhaps now what you're doing with the new company that might be a little bit different from what you did in the past, where it comes to that early kind of go-to-market.
I could start. So assuming it's B2B, this is, in my mind, mostly stayed the same in that for the first, whether it's 18 months or a dozen customers or whatever metric it is, pretty much 80 to 90% of the deal flow will come from founder-led sales. So now there are tools that help some other team members assist the founder to be more scalable, supporting them on LinkedIn outbounding or whatever it may be. But it's still, what you're selling is more a promise, and you don't have a track record, and therefore your credibility needs to step in to make up the difference, and as such be able to close deals. So early stage, founder-led sales is, in my mind, and from founders that I've seen, as much of a thing as it's always been. But the goal then becomes to make it scalable, to have an amazing team to be able to sort of replicate and repeat and run, and hopefully a product that over time has more credibility, use cases, traction, to essentially hold its own.
I think the early phases of finding that product market fit are many times faster now because there are several things that have become faster. It's faster to research your spaces, validate, build prototypes, validate proposals. But as a result, it's also become a lot noisier in any industry you're in to find your differentiation, your fit. So I think we have to, today, no matter what industry you're in, operate at a very different pace of validation and therefore need more discipline while doing that on a more time-constrained basis. So I think that's a big difference versus 10 years ago, and certainly changes how you think about what are the points of validation, the talent I need, how quickly do I get to a certain milestone relative to how things used to operate.
As a relatively early stage founder based in the UK, we hear a lot about maybe staying in Europe, maybe going to San Francisco, setting up in the States. So that if you were an early stage founder in London now, or in Europe really, and putting perhaps like European patriotism or something like that to one side, how would you look at cheaper hiring in the UK versus the potential promise of greater commercial success in somewhere like California?
So this was actually an interesting question for us even 10 years ago. I was couch surfing in California for 6 months. I mean, back then it seemed like that would be the only place to start a company. And we were actually lucky to choose to move back to the UK for the primary reason of talent and hiring. It turned out to be lucky because the UK turned into such a great hub for AI, engineering, and so forth. But we still ended up with close to 80% of our business being in the US. So I think those types of things are clearly easier now you can choose to be wherever you want and to look at the places where you have talent. You also have choices like, do you want to be a remote first company, et cetera, that are different. But I do think that there are many competitive advantages to being based in the UK and Europe in terms of a talent density perspective and in terms of how you find your competitive advantages. But obviously it depends on your industry and so forth. I do think that in order to operate effectively in the US, you can, or any part of the world, you can be very laser focused on how you create the sort of points of expertise rather than having to be fully based there. The same applies to countries within Europe. But I think optimizing for what type of hub do we want and do we need a hub and where the talent sits, I think is much easier now in how I think about it.
Yeah. You mentioned affordability. Just to add to what Sultan said, for me, it's accessibility and longevity is actually much more important. So the UK and especially London, talent, engineering talent, AI talent is far, far, far more accessible to an early stage startup than it is in the US, just because of the fierce competition from the hyperscalers and many, many other startups. And they stay longer, which also really, really counts. As opposed to in the Bay Area, it's not unusual for people to jump once a year to a new startup. Affordability is a distant third consideration, because when it comes to it, this is a game of outliers. And if you're an outlier, you're going to have no problem with funding. And yeah, you'll pay above market, but it doesn't matter because everything's growing exponentially anyway. I would also add one thing in that historically, to build a unicorn, you needed about $300 million. And that meant you'd have to go to the US eventually. And so you'd have to raise from US funds, and that you had to show US traction. More than half of Onfido's revenue was also from the US. But that's changed is you don't need to raise as much money. I think the next unicorns will be built with a fraction of that, maybe 10, 20, $30 million, as opposed to 300. And that there's plenty of funds and capital in Europe to achieve it. So for many reasons, I'm actually far more optimistic about the next wave of unicorns relative to the US being in greater proportion here in Europe.
Thank you. Can I just build on that? So question over here. And regarding betting on tomorrow and perseverance, so I'm involved in the startup. It is a huge vision. It's implementing a circular economy and a retail environment that has all those fantastic sustainability outcomes. We've been driving this for solidly for 12 months since we've received funding. We have teams of about 8 people. We're out there. We're at events. We're outbound calling. All those types of things. What's your top tip for a founder that has committed so much to this mission and yet still struggles? Right? We know this is inevitable. We will have connected systems and AI-driven systems that will build a sustainable and ecologically sensitive economy. And this is a solution for that. But what are your tips? How do we sustain our drive? Or maybe what are your tips in terms of sense checking our vision and our mission and the practicalities around it?
one thing I'd say is it's hard to time the market, but it's important to recognize, are you actually in the market at the right time? And if not, is there a form of market that there is a right time for, rather than sort of being frustrated that you're doing something that's inevitable, but it's, you're too far away from it. When I talked earlier about deciding in bets, there's actually a great book called Thinking in Bets, which is a lady called Annie Duke, and she touches a little bit on this topic of, are you actually thinking probabilistically, or are you rationalizing your own conviction because you're so invested in it? And it's important to find a framework that allows you to think more objectively and sort of to challenge yourself in order to figure out, maybe you should just be patient, but maybe there's a way of breaking out what does patience look like in a much more objective way. When I look back at when we started, we were probably in a similar boat of trying to create a category and being excited by no one's done this before, and we were probably 3 years too early, and in the end we sort of waited it out, but you have to make that a conscious choice, and I think in our case that wasn't at the time a conscious choice, we just sort of kept surviving. But I think trying to find what are the things that tell you what is this going to look like and what makes me more informed would probably be the first advice I'd give.
To pick up on one of the key points in Sultan's presentation, in that at the pre-product market fit stage, pivoting should be a source of pride. You are not to pivot after pre-product market fit, but at pre-product market, if necessary, a few times. With Onfido, there's at least 3 pivots. My new startup, there's been at least 5. Some of the team have whiplash because of the pivots. But the point is, source of pride, but then once you're anchored to product market fit, you really must not. The distinction for me is very straightforward. It's if you're chasing customers, you're at pre-product market fit. If you have customers that are chasing you, you're at post-product market fit. So one useful thing that you might try is, given the biases that we carry as founders, is to take your most conservative or skeptical, it could be a colleague or an investor, on 10 calls with customers. I just ask them a series of questions to gauge, and there are frameworks to gauge how keen they are on what you're suggesting or your solution. In fact, much more important is how much of a problem they have, and then on to what your thoughts around how to solve that could be, and then get their thoughts on it and as to whether you should stay the course or make changes. I would say one final thing in that the most important advice to an early stage founder is be relentless about picking a massive burning problem. My whole view around startups is actually, and this is, I could trace back to Onfido, we were working on such a massive problem that our customers had no choice but to use us. And they were okay for 2 or 3 years for us to be a chaotic mess until we figured it out, because they had no alternative and because it was such a massive problem. And that I can see over and over again. The difference is now you've got many, many more competitors. So it's not, you have to be quick and you have to be good. But the most important thing an early stage company could do is be certain you're working on a white hot problem and then keep pivoting until you're able to address it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, guys. That was great. Give it up for our amazing speakers.